Chapter: A Knight-Errant Errant. He had the look of a lost puppy, and Francis knew the knight would be climbing onto the cart and joining them for a while. Often his mind got ahead of reality in this way, and Francis was hardly ever wrong. Right in the most useless fashion. The situation was different once the prediction happened. In this way, he was both right and wrong. Like in his mind, he'd predicted that this knight would be young and injured. He was youngish and injured-ish. A sprained ankle in his 31st summer. The knight stood, hobbled awkwardly down to the stopped cart with the funny-looking travelers. He bowed. He was Grail Hawkthorne of the Hawkthorns on the river, an old landed family claiming many acres which had never been very coveted. He'd left home to find a way to be on the family crest. More metaphorically than literally. An adventure thwarted by the illness of his steward, who caught an inflammation of the chest and had trouble breathing for many weeks before passing suddenly in the night. Grail had loved this steward, who in fits of extravagance had proclaimed himself to be Grail's biographer. Being in constant presence of this person who was recording his every move and graceful choice had made Grail feel like a true knight, even though very little of note happened in their travels. He'd glided through life with a cheerful disposition. To describe his personality in a sentence, Grail liked liking things. He liked the mood of liking. He liked tournaments and enthusiasm. He was liked by women, though he was often oblivious to their positive reception, and this was probably what made him likable in the first place. For the first time, Grail was battling with a feeling he'd never previously known. Melancholy. Standing in front of the cart, he really didn't have any hopes that the direction these travelers were going would coincide with his own. In fact, it felt like the only reason he'd stood and approached the cart was these travelers were an odd enough couple he could risk humiliation. They were certainly not of a class which would look down on his lowered status. Grail stood stiffly, his hands at his hips. Francis recognized an aura of suffering, had already done so with Grail sitting on the small hill. As Grail's formal introduction rolled into his eardrums, Francis smiled. The formalities of life amused him now. In youth they had seemed such a burden. Fake. He'd thought the world only filled with phonies trying to posture. But now he observed these formalities as earnest attempts to represent the individual soul. Absurd attempts, but what else was there? Everything was absurd. Sometimes Francis compared humanity to ants. Mostly you'd see ants in groups, but occasionally there would be one all by itself, out on a mission to forage or understand and report back, randomly picking up sensations from the earth, hoping it would find the big caloric gain. What that ant didn't realize was even though it was on its own, it was really part of a larger category of other searchers, and it was expected to fail. There were more failures than successes, but this was okay, because even on its own, it was part of the group. Francis was thinking about himself. Druids, Francis thought, were a very self-indulgent personality, but a very self-aware type of self-indulgence. You had to be self-indulgent to be a wanderer, find joy in the little things. Like an ant on its own, the only way to find purpose was to indulge moments of itself. Francis realized, tripping back into focus of what was in front of him, the young knight and Spliff were coming to an agreement. Francis had a sense, then. What Spliff was doing was not an outpouring of benevolence or goodwill, but taking others on his journey home was a feature of the gnome's mischievousness. As Francis looked at Spliff, there was a twinkle in his eye. Maybe the gnome had always wanted to be a leader of a band of misfits, but things had never worked out that way. For the moment, Francis was happy to make Spliff happy and jumped down from the wagon to help the knight on board. The next afternoon, the merry band had to find a place to stop and feed Spliff's mare well. This part of the continent hadn't received much rain. The grasses seemed prematurely dry. They found a grove of trees and they walked the mare off the road to enjoy some shaded grasses. They had enough water for today and only today. Francis speculated about searching for a stream. It would be easier to forage near water. This time of year there might be watercress, wild asparagus, chive, huntweed. Spliff didn't seem to be listening. They'd pulled the cart out of the road, but it was still several hundred yards from the copse they'd walked to, and Spliff was having anxiety about his large trunk which he'd left behind on the cart. Francis spoke for Spliff, said reassuringly he should stay and keep an eye on things. Francis would go looking for water alone. He went back to the cart to grab a couple of small, empty kegs when he noticed the young knight following him. He was still hobbling on one ankle, and Francis encouraged him to stay and rest. "I just feel so useless," the knight said, trying to hide the whiny misery behind his words. "Ah," Francis replied. He knew the feeling well. There's more truth in feeling useless than any other emotion. You feel useless because you're suffering, but suffering is only means by which we learn grace. Francis believed these words. In all his years of exploration, he'd gotten heavily involved with the writings of the mystic Druids, often hoping they'd help him in his goal to transmogrify. The writings were cryptic and difficult, unhelpful, because they said the same things as each other, sentiments which were impossible to understand from words alone. The words were like bricks on a path to nowhere. You followed them and realized they led nowhere, and at first this was frustrating. Then, slowly, one realized this nowhere place was difficult to find because of the mind, one's desire to have a path in the first place. To find the place which was nowhere, you had to realize you were already there. It was a hard concept for the mind which had senses, a mind which suffered. You look around and you're always somewhere and something is causing the pain. It was a strange lesson to learn. Maybe it shouldn't even be called a lesson. A lesson seemed to be a feature of life easily taught and transferred. Francis realized this lesson was not a concept everyone was meant to learn. One might have accused Francis of arrogance, but he was pretty well convinced there were biological limitations, and some people literally didn't have the internal mechanisms for nowhere to not be the most frightening place imaginable. To the extent that the mystic proselytized, Francis assumed they'd totally missed the point of nowhere. Nowhere was also everywhere. Every individual was already in nowhere. It was not your duty to make sure they understood this nothing about everywhere. Which is all to say, Francis had no urge to expand any further for the young knight. Grail was trying to figure out what to say in response. Previously, he wouldn't have thought twice about the Druid's words, but he was currently feeling guilty that he couldn't live up to the idea of himself, and was chasing any way to not feel this guilt. "You are a very fine knight, I can tell," Francis said as he walked past Grail, the words insincere but well-meaning. He was distracted, thinking about where he was headed, through the grove of trees and into the other pasture, worried the stream here would be intermittent and not running during this dry summer. "How can you tell?" Grail asked, turning to follow again, asking about himself. Francis laughed. "Well, I can't, really, but you seemed like you needed some encouragement." "You think I don't know what I'm doing," Grail replied. This comment made Francis stop. It was a question of near desperation, almost like the one you'd hear at a tavern and know the person was intoxicated and past the point of consciousness. Francis had heard this tone many times. "You think you're better than me?" Francis looked to see the knight's grieving face. Perhaps the walk was necessary for his soul. The ankle would likely hold. Francis told the knight to grab the last small keg, which had previously held beer, and follow him. Francis talked to soothe any potential tension. "I've often thought about a creator making our ankles. Seems like such a flawed design, small hinges upon which the weight of a creature is supposed to depend. Like our throats. How many have died from simply taking a too hearty bite of mutton?" "I saved an old woman from that very thing once. I hit her square on the back with my fist, and stew flew across the room," Grail said. Through the first copse, Francis paused, waiting for the knight, scanning options from the tree groupings in the distance. Where they were now seemed lower in elevation. Maybe a stream was in this clearing. He looked for tall stems of reed. "So what does that mean, you learned grace through suffering?" Grail asked, masking his pain as he hobbled. Francis answered distractedly. Oh, one of those things that you understand in principle but hardly ever in practice. I believe it's supposed to come after the fact. You don't learn it in the moment. You understand it later, with reflection. Although Grail nodded, he didn't understand this concept of reflection. I thought grace was bestowed upon you by God. That's why you asked for it in prayer. Francis shrugged. So why are you going to the city? Grail asked. Might as well. Are you going all the way? Francis asked. It's where I was going. I heard a great wizard lives there now, and he's hiring knights for his personal guard, Grail said. Francis mumbled as he continued walking. Payment meant obligation, meant control. Eventually they found a small stream barely running. Francis dug a dam with his hands and waited for a pool to gather. You don't seem very excited about the city, Grail noted. I need to make some good money. I need oils for my armor and sword. I had to sell my horse. Look at me, I'm turning into a decrepit old man. Grail sat down with a groan. An old man might feel younger than you currently do. We only feel our age in moments. Mostly, one is timeless, Francis said dreamily. You don't like to live in reality much, do you? Grail wasn't being mean-spirited, just noting the obvious. He continued proudly. My father was a harsh man, but he taught me a lot about reality. So did mine, Francis agreed. And it's true, I didn't like his teachings very much. Grail felt lonely sitting with this bearded stranger in the middle of nowhere. He missed his steward who spoke highly of him and gave Grail confidence. What was there to like about this druid? He didn't even bother to make himself likable. This druid would not fare well in the city. Grail already knew that much. The druid would leave shortly after arrival and return to his roots and berries. One needed to like a city, to form a connection to it and the other people who liked the city too. Grail could slip into the role of protector easily. For things he liked, he could fight off all antagonists. Or ignore them. They were obviously just trying to get a reaction from the superior position. Many peasants did this. They stayed peasants because they spent their waking hours in hatred when they were supposed to do was love their leaders. Actually, now that he thought about it, he was feeling better sitting out here with this druid who would fail in the city. It made Grail feel like he wasn't as much of a screw-up as he thought. And in that moment he was grateful to the druid. He was already grateful to the gnome who was funding his ride, but maybe he could see why a gnome, a practical creature like himself, might oblige these odd spiritualists. Back at camp with soup on the flames, Grail asked questions about Spliff's home city. He'd heard much about it recently, and gnomes had become almost mythical figures in his mind, incredibly industrious and clever. I hear it's the city of the future, Grail commented, taking some water boiled with seeds in a small carved cup offered by the druid. I don't see how it could be. It's pretty insular, Spliff responded, thanking Francis for a cup of tea. It may have been, way back in the day. You haven't heard? They say the reincarnation of Falcior has returned, Grail said. Who? Spliff asked, not sure he'd heard correctly. The first wizard, the wizard who passed on the knowledge of making swords. I seriously doubt that was one guy. Spliff thought back to his and the druid's conversation about knowledge. I'm sure it was a series of gnomes. Mythology is convenient and meaningful, not meant to be taken literally. Grail was taken aback, but hit it well. He had chosen some odd ducks to ride with. What's the future? Francis chimed in, drinking down his steaming cup of tea in one gulp. There are druids who say there's no such thing as the future or the past. Who's ever been to the past? Now is the eternity and only. Francis knelt down and poured himself another cup of tea from his kettle. Neither of the other two said anything, so he continued. All creatures are designed with the biological future in mind. Reproduction, growth, all of biological existence is designed for future activity. Now is the future, and the future is now. If all of life is designed for the future, then every city is a city of the future, as is every blade of grass a blade of grass of the future. I'm more interested in its past as a city. Not every blade of grass has a past. Grail looked down into the swirling particulate in his tea, wondering if he was safe from poisoning. He looked from the druid to the gnome, his face alternating between stern and confounded at his new circumstance and companions. What came to mind was a line his steward used to repeat. The rest is history. He'd always wondered about the rest. The rest of what? But in this moment, listening to these strange non-men talk about the future, he felt freed of such serious trivialities. The future would abide his vision, eventually. Chapter Ionata, City of the Future. At the peak of the small hill which gave the group their first views of Ionata, Spliff thought he was looking at a different mountain, more beautiful and impressive. The glass panels which were inserted in huge clusters into the southern top of the mountain, the side facing the town below, seemed to glow from inside. Even when he'd left, he didn't think he had turned to observe the city from this distance. He'd been hurried in leaving and didn't want to look back with any perspective. Yet it seemed very odd to think he'd never looked at the mountain from a distance. Maybe he had looked when he left. He was just spiritually different upon return. Maybe he was seeing Ionata with new eyes. Maybe he'd missed home so much his inner spirit was glowing to see it. In any case, he marked the looks on his companions' faces, which were equally impressed. Francis was surprised he was impressed. The big glass panels made one ponder how they were crafted and fitted into the rock. Francis rarely allowed himself awe at the feats of creatures because they so often only obscured the beauty of nature, but the mountain really was a sight to behold. They lingered for almost half an hour before Grail got anxious and antsy and urged the party downwards. As they moved down into the valley, the suburbs before the mountain, Little Iona as it was colloquially known, their mood deflated into practical skepticism. As they passed their first tavern inn, Francis commented on the large flag which hung vertically down from the roof above the door. He turned his head sideways to try and focus on the picture. It was a fist holding a lightning bolt. Someone fancied themselves powerful. The streets outside the mountain seemed worse to Spliff, beaten and dusty from heavy traffic. As they approached the entrance, it had an enhanced security gate, which had not been there when he left. One half of the road leading to the mountain door had a narrow cattle-style chute for miners to enter and exit without being checked by the guards. Most of these miners now appeared to be human. This was odd. For as long as the mines had existed, they were only allowed use by gnomes. Facing away from the giant gate doors swung outwards during the day was a large statue of a human. The crudely chiseled face turned towards the heavens. An arm was raised above the statue's head with one finger pointing upwards. On top of that finger was a lightning bolt balancing. Spliff halted his mare as the group in the wagon was approached by guards. Spliff had never known there to be guards at the city gate. If there was any danger, it was known in advance, and the big iron gates would be shut. Would be shut on some holiday occasions as well. Now there was a ramshackle guard post with a gnome inside who seemed to be controlling the operations for the larger human guards. "Papers?" the human guard demanded gruffly. Spliff had never had papers. He had a certificate commemorating his birth, but he left it at his sister's. Spliff explained this in so many words. As the guards conferred, Francis asked Spliff quietly how many years it had been since he'd been back. 10, maybe 11 summers, Spliff said. Francis examined Spliff's face, trying to work out if he was hiding something. Maybe there had been more to his asking him on this journey than spontaneous camaraderie. But Spliff seemed genuinely confused. In the back of the cart, Grail rummaged through his rucksack. A few other merchants and travelers passed by, papers already in hand. Finally, they were allowed entrance with instruction to stop by the commissars for identification papers. If the papers were not obtained, they would not be allowed return entrance. Trotting into the mountain, Spliff's home no longer felt like home. Even Francis, who could usually look past the bad vibes humans were capable of exuding, he was so used to them they could almost be comforting in their predictability. It felt odd. Like maybe he should jump out of the cart and walk anywhere else. 2. Getting entrance papers was much less hassle than Francis had expected. Gnomes received good faith in their choice of compatriots. The gnomes who worked for the commissar's office seemed in decent enough spirits. Grail, as a landed knight, was used to formality and stood stiffly. balancing out the scruffy roughness Francis's beard gave off in rooms with floors of polished stone. As they exited the building with papers, Spliff looked confused and felt deeply out of sorts. His first order of business was to go to his youngest sister's house. He had presumed she would be in the same place, but he now realized that any presumption could be wrong. And, he thought, perhaps more than anything, it was this fact which was throwing him. He had presumed the city would stay frozen in time and his family along with it. What a dumb presumption. Of course things would change. Change this much, though? Freed of obligation, the trio took a minute to look around. This close to the mountain's entrance, there was afternoon light coming in through the large entrance, but looking up the slow spiral arc of the road which led to the dome, the lights on the side of the homes and shops along the road illuminated in such a way Francis thought he was hallucinating again. Had felt odd inside the commissar's building, too. The lamps seemed to be pulsating, almost like a heartbeat. The fixtures on all the buildings along the road, where oil lamps would have been sporadically lit or not lit at this time of day, were instead all illuminated and connected by what looked like grey rope which snaked between them. Spliff drove his horse and cart slowly up the street while the two humans walked. Francis was finding the experience very charming. The roadside cottages built on top of each other, the shops in miniature, consistent pings of metal shaping behind closed doors. In front and behind them, donkeys pulled sleds with stiff iron struts. Sleds filled with gnomes in mining gear, getting a ride up, or crates of foodstuffs and crafting materials. Mostly empty sleds going down, though occasionally another horse and cart with finished goods for the outside world. Small roadside vendors of simple foods looked at the group heading up the road with bored acknowledgement. Spliff only had one trick up his sleeve to orient himself before heading to see his sister. His preferred tavern he'd spent so many years silently drinking and scribbling in. He'd become friendly with the proprietor. Spliff asked Grail to stay with the cart, which had to stay on the main road, as they slipped into one of the short alleys. There was just enough room for a human of Francis's modest size to slip between shops and a cottage above them and into the covered alley and find the bar with its sliding wood panel doorway. Spliff marveled at the light in the alley. Where oil lamps with their flame stains on the walls had previously been illuminated, were glass bulbs of an alternating deep purple and orange color. Francis ducked and stooped, following Spliff into the tavern. Inside were lights of a similar hue, though the purple seemed deeper. Francis approached one of these lamps as Spliff went towards the bar. Francis tapped the glass with a fingernail. The light coming from inside was not dissimilar from an oil lamp, turned very low, but it was also brighter somehow. The more he looked, he noticed that there were small pieces of metal which seemed to be glowing inside the glass. He must have been standing and observing for a while, trying to deduce the magic at play, because Spliff had to call him over to the bar. Spliff was speaking to an older female gnome with an eyeglass hanging around her neck between a few other sparkly and unconventional necklaces. His estimation of these necklaces were that they were eccentric, but not valuable. His favorite type of person. Eccentric and valuable only to themselves. Perhaps that was why he didn't wear jewelry, or had never found any attraction to it. He didn't know which parts of him would be revealed by doing so. All of a sudden he had a lot of thoughts and opinions about jewelry. It was fine for him to be lost in thought. Spliff had called him over, but he didn't seem very concerned with Francis's participation in the conversation, though, as he approached, they switched over to the common tongue for his benefit. Thankfully, the new humans get in, get out. You ever notice their smell? Kind of like rotting pumpkins. No offense to you, Mr. Druid. Jemima, the proprietor, winked at him as he approached. In fact, I rather like the smell some days. Makes me want to climb the handsome ones, if you know what I mean. Francis could see why Spliff liked her. The idea of humans and gnomes mating hadn't previously crossed his mind, which now became distracted with strange imaginations. Spliff continued talking. So they mostly stay out of your hair, then? Yes, hasn't been such a bad arrangement so far. I prefer this light from the heavens. Gives me less to do each night. I go in the back, pull this small lever, and everything goes dark. In the morning, I push it forward, everything's back on. I used to always spill that oil on myself. And this man, from the statue out front, he came and brought this light from heaven to the city? Spliff asked, confused. Well, they say he needed the mountain to get closer to the sky. The council built him a great big workshop up there, and they let him habitate in the glass house. You know how coveted real estate is in the dome. And so what, no strings attached? Spliff asked. I think the council made a deal about supporting progeny after his death, and of course the humans get to mine in one of the shafts. You remember hearing stories about that shaft with the fire demon? I agreed with the council. Fine, I said. If they want to go down there and get killed, how's that any of business of mine? Spliff gave Francis a sidelong look. Francis worried that this was starting to sound too much like a plot. He didn't belong in plots. He was a wandering druid. He felt himself get nervous, or maybe it was a twinge of excitement. Excitement wasn't a feeling often cultivated by making tinctures and pulling up parsnip root. Occasionally he'd get excited finding a spring bloom of black lotus flowers because they were so eminently delicious, but that felt like a very different type of excitement. No, this was nerves, definitely anxiety. He asked if he might get a pint of ale. I'll do you one better, Jemima declared. One of Ionata's own has returned. Such an occasion deserves the best. She turned and dipped under her counter to bring out a jug. It was earthenware, so the druid couldn't see inside, but from the sound of Spliff's groan, Francis knew the day was going to be very different from here. Chapter: The Milk of Thunder. Nearly stumbling as he exited the alley, Francis said to Spliff, but really to himself, After the first shot, I swear I'd never felt more sober in my life, like a slap to the soul. The strength of the alcohol had been like a quick dunk in a cold bath, followed quickly by the lazy happiness of a warm spring day. Now, however, he was very much feeling the slight angle of everything in the mountain, especially the road, which he realized he had to lean into to stand up straight. The liquor apparently did something extra for gnomes. It was enhanced by drying and fermenting a very elusive species of worm which lived in the mines. Jemima had talked at length about the process and history of the beverage with Francis's fascinated encouragement. It must have put pep in Spliff's step, because he hopped onto the cart and started urging on his mare, so Francis had to hurry up and jump in the back. Spliff's heart was beating faster than usual. Could another name for the soul be blood pressure? The way the conversation had progressed into the banality of everyday concerns had given his mind time to slip into his own speculation. Luckily, the alcohol was relaxing him and leaving open the possibility it was all nothing. Lamps without oil. He was surprised such an invention hadn't happened sooner. Still, it was confusing how this wizard supposedly channeled the power of lightning. Storms of lightning were not consistently happening. It was impossible humans mining in the tunnel where he'd found a theramite could only be a coincidence, right? It was now dusk as the cart clacked up the last bit of ascent to the dome. Everything leveled off at the top, and the lights of early evening sun were still glowing through the thick glass windows in the ceiling. Large marble pillars were the central features around which everything else had to be constructed. Actually, Francis thought, the worm liquor intensifying his concentration, this view alone made the journey worth it. With the warm amber glow of the sun treating the glass panes like canvas, the lights of the city twinkled like crystals in a stream. Whereas the colors inside the tavern had been designed to feel homey and comfortable, the lights in the dome were designed for spectacle, to make the occupants of the dome feel special. The pillars were studded with ornamental lights of bright blue. At the top of the pillars were light which seemed to mimic snow, like the reflection from the top of a mountain. The cottages were even more tightly packed than the slope, with balconies like ponderous steps one could only imagine trying to climb. Everything felt clean, which was very pleasing at first, but the more Francis sat with the feeling, it seemed purposefully juxtaposed with the grit of the slope leading here, and that felt a little too on the nose. Like to live in the dome meant sacrificing one's capacity to produce irony. Like everything and everyone living below was meant to be muddled through until you came, once again, to the experience of true, clean living. Francis was daydreamily thinking about juxtapositions in societies and cities, without realizing the cart was not going to move any further. Two gnomes in threadbare garb rolled over a miniature minecart and began to unload the trunks Francis was sitting on into a smaller cart. Spliff spoke to them in Gnomish and then informed his companions that there were no horses or carts in the dome. They were returned to stables outside the mountain. Spliff gave one of the gnomes a couple coins, and after a brief exchange, one of them climbed onto the cart and turned Spliff's mare back down the mountain. "I don't think I have the coin for an inn up here," Grail said with an air of guilt and melancholy at his lowered station. Francis agreed with a laugh. Spliff asked Grail if he wouldn't mind pushing the cart with his trunks. He added, "Don't worry, I'll find a way to cover your stay." Grabbing the cart, Grail looked to the side of the slope entrance, where a large gate was pushed closed against the wall. The gate looked like it hadn't been moved in some time. It was hard to get paid as a mercenary if people weren't at least occasionally afraid. The roads in the dome were narrow, but they felt wider without only dark earth overhead. Grail felt both demeaned pushing the cart, and it also felt good to be of service. Francis should have been jealous of Grail's self-absorption. Francis was used to keeping his eyes open and scanning the horizon or lazily observing flora, and he was finding the dome overwhelming. He was not used to the bustle. He found his vision slipping in and out of focus on details, like a female gnome in a white dress, her hair made up and dyed green, piled on her head like a cluster of emeralds. A glassblower's workshop, which contributed much of the decoration he saw in the streets. Curls of ornamental twisted glass, inspired by the shapes of plants and iconography from the mines. Whereas the shops on the slope had seemed very practical, the market here seemed to cater to a wealthier tourist class. The food vendors had glass tables of various sizes to accommodate gnome and human alike. Despite being enclosed in the dome, Francis felt a breeze. He was brushed by a burly human carrying a large sack of goods, and goose pimples popped up on his flesh. He was going to ask Spliff about the breeze, but then he surmised that the breeze was likely quite necessary. With the heat of the sun, the whole place could become a kiln. They had to keep it circulated with mountain air. The whole experience was invigorating for Grail. There seemed to be a lot of coin floating around. It reignited his optimism in making money. Spliff led them through the market and into the residential area where the foot traffic diminished, which Francis was grateful for. The small cottages built on top of each other seemed slightly larger than the ones stacked above the market stalls. Spliff halted the party at a door. They'd taken 2 steps into a half alleyway. On the door was a glass recreation of the mountain with dome, a bit redundant and unimaginative, Francis thought, judgmentally of the ornamentation. Spliff pulled the cord which rang the bell. While waiting, Spliff had a spontaneous reaction of insecurity, and so he attempted to push his head of curls into the configuration they usually looked best. Everyone was surprised when a human woman crouched down through the opening. Luckily for her, she was small for a human. Spliff sputtered the first words, confused. Sorry, I was looking for my sister, Ida." The small human woman was taken aback as well. After a brief exchange of confusion, they discovered no one of that name lived here. She rented the cottage to sleep in when she came to the mountain. As she expressed apologies and turned to close the door, the oddness of her visitors made her feel like they were actually looking for a Haida and not simply trying to scam her like gnomes sometimes did to foreigners in the mountain. She asked where they were from, and Spliff explained he was from here, but he hadn't been home in quite some time. The person she had rented the cottage from had been an emissary, very classy. Maybe it might be possible. "I doubt this could be the Haida you mean," but the smaller woman reached into the cottage for a flyer. "They gave one of these to all the merchants this week." She handed the flyer to Spliff. For what seemed an eternity, he stood reading the words over and over. Francis finally had to walk over and read over his shoulder out of curiosity. 2. Francis read the flyer as they continued walking through the streets. It was an invitation to a party called the Milk of Thunder, hosted by Maestro Keppo and Mistress Haida. The flyer encouraged wearing white. Grail finally needed some questions answered. Where are we going? He was asking himself as much as anyone, his arms and legs starting to feel heavy from pushing the cart. It's not far now, Spliff spoke for the first time since leaving the cottage. The street must have always been for the who's who living in the dome. Once they turned the corner, this was obvious. For one, it featured the first living plants that Francis had noticed since arriving in the city. Shrubbery, patches of roses. The street itself was narrower and the doors were wider, indicating more space built back into the homes. The old oil lamps which would have previously illuminated the street were covered with a glass of light blue. Various humans and gnomes dressed in white eyed this ragtag group. Fleeting looks of annoyance flashed across their faces at having to deal with the intrusion of someone pushing a cart down the street. Spliff, Grail, and Francis felt self-conscious almost simultaneously, though of course it took longer for Francis. He was busy trying to figure out what species of colorful bird was flitting between two small fruit trees. Grail was feeling anxious now. He was starting to go to the internal place he called his gray monster. He became like gray clay, capable of molding into whatever the situation would require of him. This meant turning off certain parts of himself. The gray monster could be heartless. It had let innocent bystanders take punishment they didn't deserve. But the gray monster also absorbed heavier blows. When the punishment came for him, it hurt less when he was the gray monster. The group stopped in front of large doors where the majority of guests were entering and exiting. Spliff looked over the house and gave a history of how back when he was living in the dome, this building had been an event space. Spliff waved at Grail and told him to leave the cart in the street. His possession seemed frivolous at the moment. Maybe it was the worm liquor still warming his blood, but Spliff took a step of confidence towards the party. It didn't take long for a pack of 4 humans with thin rapiers on their belts standing by the door to stop the scraggly bunch. Their eyes held the most disdain for our wandering druid, who had decided to take off his boots when he was riding in the cart and had been walking through the dome with bare feet. He had also not removed his pack, which had moss stains, and his tinctures and ironwood kettle rattled inside. The guards didn't need to tell them to halt. Before questioning words could accelerate any tension, a drunk older gnome with thick eyeglasses recognized Spliff. He shouted excitedly. Spliff immediately recognized his boss from the research lab. As he ambled over happily, the 4 humans with rapiers dispersed. By God, this disheveled gnome muttered like he'd discovered a new, fascinating substance. We all thought you for dead. Hello, Toppler. Spliff tried to make his voice cheerful and excited. Is that how big this party has gotten? It finally reached whatever cave you were pouting in? Nope, brand news, Spliff misspoke nervously. The 2 gnomes exchanged a few sentences in Yomish, which Francis enjoyed. He liked the sound of language he didn't understand. It gave him time to step outside, or inside, become the future of the moment, and pay simple attention to the biological information being exchanged. This could be as simple as the gesticulations and as complex as the bacterial cloud. The aura of organisms one spent most of their time around. This gnome definitely gave off a pungent odor. Wine, a whiff of fecal carelessness. Mellowin had often used the phrase fecal carelessness to describe druids he didn't like, who were too removed from human concerns to hold a conversation or worry about their hygiene. And Francis had wondered if Mellowin hadn't taken on a series of apprentices specifically to avoid this outcome he could see happening to himself. Francis, in return, had joked about needing feces for mushroom growth. He kind of liked this fecal smell. If one really paid attention to its nuances, and it had to be nuanced, it had a mucousy component like a woman exuded when she was excited to copulate. What fairies had put that thought in his brain? Too many moons had passed since he'd laid with a woman. He couldn't count how long. He missed the intimacy, but he didn't miss the consequences of said intimacy. It was more soothing to hug a tree. He started wandering towards one of the fruit trees to get a closer look before Spliff called him back to the conversation. "We're going inside," Spliff said at Francis, his eyes furtive and emotional, in need of validation. Francis realized, at this moment, he was the only true friend Spliff had because he was the only one who knew his secret of a theramite. Francis felt honored and indicated with a nod he was understood. Francis clapped Grail on the shoulder, as much to rally himself as the young knight. The gesture didn't matter. Grail had already gone into self-protection mode and was going to stay on Spliff's hip until a radically better position was offered. One only got so many chances at making friends. Yes, one's virtue and integrity were commodities, but one could not sell them an infinite amount of times. They walked on, awkwardly. The drunk gnome, who was wearing a long white shirt, like an oversized human shirt, continued chattering in Yomish to Spliff as he led them through the spattering of guests and into the party proper. Looking inside the home, Francis couldn't imagine what all the space would be used for. Without a roof, this home seemed only like facade, background for a stage play. The walls only necessary to hide costume changes and actors taking snorts from wine bottles and fanning themselves. Once inside, it still felt like a play reality. The primary features seemed to be staircases which led to levels of varying height and not connected to each other. Looking upwards, the floors were placed above each other at odd angles so each could receive a little sun. The staircases were like individual pieces of art, distinct. One made of wood, another metal. Right in front of them, 10 paces from the entrance, were smaller steps made of glass, which were literally art. They were only 3 steps, going nowhere, with a glass gnome reclined on the middle step, hand on head and elbow extended as if to symbolize pause in a journey. Above everything were huge wooden crossbeams, which seemed to support all the stairs in lieu of a ceiling. The beams were illuminated by a spattering of small lights, which reminded Francis of a night in the forest when he'd been surrounded by lightning bugs. Toppler led them up a narrow spiral staircase of green-tinged metal. Francis and Grail had to duck under a different staircase to get to the base and hunched up the stairs like they were in some princess's dream house for her dolls. When they breached into the level, it was a surprisingly large space for being suspended by these crossbeams. There was a large table in the middle with a glass fountain made to look like a cloud, which had 3 streams of milky liquid continuously pouring out. "First things first," Toppler said to the group in common tongue while leading them to the table and gesturing they grab a glass. Francis didn't hesitate. The taste was quite interesting, like a sweet and spicy tree bark and a berry flavor he'd only ever tasted once before. The base was a sparkling wine, and he would have thought the milkiness to be a cream, but he didn't taste any animal product. Maybe the fruit was white. As he was tasting and thinking, Francis wondered if all the stairs were like a metaphor, being at the top of the dome. For gnomes who'd had to spend their lives in dark corners, perhaps stairs were symbolic. Behind the large sculpture was a series of chaise lounge arranged in a circle, towards which Toppler was leading them. They were designed to be reclined on, but due to the bodies in the room, there were 2 or 3 butts on each piece of furniture. In the center was a series of pillows, and some gnomes sat there looking outward at the couches. Francis quickly tucked his backpack under the table, realizing it would be obtuse and rude to keep wearing at a party. Toppler encouraged Spliff to join him on the pillows, shooing away another gnome so Spliff had a spot. Francis also followed happily and spent a good minute trying to force his feet under his knees in a meditative position while still holding his glass of wine. Grail stayed standing behind the couches. He had picked up that it was undignified for a human to sit on the ground. Once Francis paid attention, he noticed a striking human woman with exotic dark coloring beneath her eyes giving him a once-over. A slight smirk accentuating a dimple in her left cheek. But there was a distracting tension as Francis looked from face to face. The gnome on the couch across from Spliff was his old friend, Keppo, who was trying to act busy, calling over a human servant to fetch some food from the lower levels. Keppo's face brightened, falsely but convincingly enough for most. "My friend! What a day to return! I have just requested the presence of your beautiful sister. As you have no doubt heard, she is my wife, and she's brought me the best luck a gnome could ask for," Keppo said. "So it seems," Spliff replied, trying to be generous in spirit. "What do you think of that wine, eh? Pretty good." Francis was trying to get a read on Keppo, but then Spliff said something in Gnomish, and by default he started to slip away from the conversation and into the relaxation of the wine, of which he already needed another glass. As if by magic, the woman whom he'd been unfortunately attracted to bent over and gave him another wine. "You're a druid, aren't you?" she asked, the lilt in her question indicating she already knew the answer. "I am what I am," Francis thanked her for the wine. "And what are you?" The woman didn't respond. Francis felt, washing her face, that not a single muscle in it had moved. His question was nothing. Pathetic. She guessed him. He was to guess her. That was the game. "Now let me guess. Familiarity with druids. Maybe you work with medicines. An apothecary." She shrugged. "Close enough. I did not mean to challenge you, Master Druid. I meant to be welcoming. It seems you are an esteemed company." Francis looked back at the gnomes. "Seems so." "You are new to the city?" "First time, first day." "It's rather remarkable, no? In your travels, have you seen anywhere else like it?" "I admit, I never thought a city could surprise me the way this one has," Francis said. "Have you always been so lucky, Master Druid?" The smirk returned to her face. Francis took a big gulp of wine. "In all but love." She laughed. "Perhaps that is the only place where luck does not apply. Love, I have heard, begins and ends with attention." Francis pondered this. It sounded true. Just then, a female gnome with a baby on her hip approached the circle, and Spliff jumped up. He gave her an embrace. He reacted kindly to the baby. Francis felt warmed in his heart. It was all going to be fine. Time to enjoy a party. It had been a long time since he'd been to a party he was happy to be at anyhow, and that had maybe never happened. Keppo also got up and stood close by his wife. After a minute of conversation, Spliff waved Francis over, and so he got up, his knees cracking predictably, walked over and put on a smile. Grail too ambled over, and there was a light exchange of pleasantries, Haida thanking the two companions for keeping her brother safe during dangerous travels. "Come," Haida said to everyone. "You must meet our Falsiar. Truly, he has given us everything we could have asked for." The mysterious woman came and stood next to Francis and walked with them as if she was destined to be by his side. Walking together, Francis finally asked her name. "The name of Mountain Air," she smiled. "I thought it was appropriate to have a Yomish name here, no? Pofim. Watch out, I can be quite chilly." It was a studied playfulness, Francis thought. Already he was presuming too much about knowing her, and it was unclear whether he was doing this himself, or if it was because that's exactly what she wanted. 3. They walked into a rock garden on the main level. The partygoers in this space seemed less festive, more demure, like a crowd quietly mingling before a show. It was an interesting collection of rock formations mixed with standing metallic sculptures. Standing away from the crowd, spinning the metal wing of an articulated bird statue, his back to the party, was the Great Wizard. Hearing the group's footsteps, the wizard turned, his robe spinning around his thighs. The wizard had a careful wave of hair the color of lava rock and a neatly trimmed beard. His robe was designed to have the puffiness that mimicked clouds. Immediately, looking at him, Francis thought, "This is no wizard." Then he caught himself. Was that a fair impression? What did he know from wizards? He certainly did not look like the Druid's version of wise, humble before the unknown. Then he thought back to a saying from his youth, "You don't have a second chance to make a first impression." A saying which he'd reacted against because it was clearly an idea designed to look down on the peasantry. It mattered not the impression a king made. One had to bow their head regardless of how the king looked. Making a good impression only mattered if you wanted to keep your head or save your spleen from the beatings by fickle bullies so worried about being nobodies themselves that they'd turn any ire on the flimsiest excuse. As such, Francis's first impression was that this human was overcompensating. But he was essentially alone in that impression. In Grail's mind, this Falcior looked the perfect picture of a wizard. Spliff, for his part, was feeling overwhelmed and not sure what to feel about anything. Haida introduced them. "And this is my long-lost brother we've often spoken of." Falcior nodded solemnly, then he paused and looked up at the mountain. "Here it comes," he said the words almost in a whisper. Falcior held his finger up in the air, and everyone in the garden held their breath. A crack like thunder rang around the halls. When the reverberation ended, everyone in the mountain cheered. A sound significantly louder than the crack itself, and the musicians in the hall started up with renewed enthusiasm. Po-Fim approached Falcior and took his arm. Together they walked behind some boulders with depictions carved in relief of gnomes working the mines. The two began talking quietly. "So," Kepo clapped his hands, signaling the interaction was over. "I bet you're tired from your journey. Let me just check, but I'm sure we can get you some rooms in the apartments. There's a whole section of them next to the house, for guests of all kinds." Kepo scurried off after the wizard and the woman behind the boulder. Haida sighed. He's so busy these days. The baby in her arms started to fuss. Spliff had a bad idea, thinking maybe he could calm the child, and offered to take her, but this only made her more fussy and start to cry, which made Spliff feel even more out of his element. He went to the corner of the garden with a table which held drinks for the party. And it was then, at that moment, standing with Grail, who he was pretty sure didn't like him very much, and a mother gnome who'd rather have been anywhere else, that Francis got the familiar party feeling he'd gotten at every party he'd ever been to. He smiled at the feeling, knowing it well. He tried to give it a name. It was like going to a ritual where what to be sacrificed was the concept of fun. At first you had to praise it, to honor the concept and its inevitable sacrifice. But everyone also had to pretend like it wasn't going to die, like they themselves weren't going to be the ones to drain all the blood from the corpse at the end. Maybe it was the lying which bothered him. Ever since his time counting coins, he'd come to hate facade. Or maybe it was just his impatient patience, knowing it would be over, might as well get to it and sacrifice fun right now. May the blessing over its corpse be the mantra of no bad days. He looked around to escape this self-monologue. At least plants had no reason to lie. Francis wandered over to look at a short shrub with leaves of orange. He wanted to look at the ground around the tree, see how much soil had been added to allow for root growth. His head near the dirt, examining stones placed by the tree, he could have sworn he heard an echo of Kepo's voice, bouncing off one of the boulders, saying not to worry, he had everything under control. Francis thought, anyone who needed to say they had control clearly didn't.